I'm going to go through the basics of graphing on the graphing calculator today. I did provide a worksheet for you to print out if you'd like. Otherwise, you could just watch. But really what I'm going to go through is how to actually graph on the graphing calculator and how to pull important information, in particular, information for sketching. Often students don't know how to get specific points pulled off the graph so that they can do a really good sketch for their instructors. Okay, let's go ahead and graph y equals x cubed minus 8. So to do that on the graphing calculator, you're going to go to the y equals button, which is right here at the top left corner. And when you select it, you will see this screen. Now, it's really important that none of these plots are highlighted black. If they are, you want to actually take that off. And the way you do that is you just arrow up, hover over them, press enter, and that'll deselect them. Now, I've pressed enter and it's actually selected it. So that's what it looks like highlighted. And that's how you take that off. Okay, so let's plug this in. Now notice it's already set up as y equals, so all we need to plug in is x cubed minus 8. Okay, so the variable button is right here next to the alpha button, the green button. So x, that's the power button. It's above the division symbol, raised to the 3 minus 8. Okay, now if you just hit graph, it will graph it, but if you've used this calculator before, if you've borrowed it from somebody, graphing it right now, it's going to graph on the standard 10 by 10 screen. But to make sure yours graphs on a standard 10 by 10 screen, you can always do that by going to zoom, which is this middle button here, and select option number 6. You can actually hit 6 or arrow down and press enter. And that's a standard 10 by 10 screen. And there's our graph. Okay, so I kind of know what the x cubed equation looks like. It kind of looks like this stretched out s, and then it's shifted really far down, mainly because of that minus 8. But that's the basic graph, and that's great. Now what I want to do is I actually want to write down some points. And at the end of the video, I'm going to go ahead and go through and sketch all of these, which you can watch just to kind of see how I'm going to do that. I'll be real quick about it. But from looking at it, it seems, if this is 10 by 10, that this is crossing the x-axis at 2, and this is crossing the y-axis at negative 8. So that's important information, but I'd like to be sure that that's where it's crossing. Well, there's a couple ways to be sure, okay? One way, actually there's 3, is using the trace button. Now, the nice thing about the trace button is often when you first pull it up, it gives you a nice point. Like in this case, it gives us the point 0, negative 8. So I'm actually going to write that down because that is a good point and it's on the graph. But when you start moving the trace button, see how it goes into decimals? And sometimes it doesn't really recover. So like, look, if I wanted to get to x equals 1, it doesn't really go to x equals 1. So it might not be as good of an option to use the trace button at this point. Okay, so another option then is to use the table. So if you hit second table, that's above the graph. So second's the yellow button, table, and this is a table of values. So notice mine started at negative 2, yours might start at 0, but if you arrow up, it starts giving you more and more values, okay? And these are great values. So 0, negative 8 I already got, 1, negative 7, that's a good one. 2, 0, oh, we thought that's where it was crossing. I'm also going to go ahead and put negative 1 and negative 9, but the rest of them are kind of large, so I think I'll leave them out. I'll just use those 4 to do the graphing. There is one other way to produce the numbers we want, and that's using what's called the table set. So that's above the window button. So if you hit second, table set, it gives me an option of where I want to start. So notice it's starting at negative 3. That's because when I was on the graph just a second ago, I was hovering over negative 3. This next value here tells you how far apart each value is going to be. In other words, it's going by ones, which is why there's no decimal. So it went to negative 3, negative 2, negative 1, 0. But this is the part that's kind of interesting. You can have the calculator wait for you to ask. So if I go down here to the independent variable and select ask, it'll automatically give me the dependent variable depending on what I put in for the independent variable. So if you go back to second table, it's blank now, and I could put in any values I want for x. So if I wanted to know where it was when it crossed the y-axis, I could put in 0. 0, negative 8 pops up. I thought it crossed the x-axis at 2, so I put in 2, and it gives me 0, and so forth. So I can always verify the points using table set. Or if I want very specific values, I could do that here. Okay, so let's go ahead and graph our next equation. Go back to the y equals button. And I'm actually going to leave this equation here. I'm going to deselect it though. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and arrow to the equal sign, hit enter, and now it's not going to graph this equation anymore. So if I just go down to the next line, I'm going to go ahead and put in the next equation. Notice I didn't actually have to hit select for the equal sign. It automatically selected the equation because I was entering it. But the nice thing about doing the graphing this way is that on a test, you may want to leave the equations on the same graph in case you want to go back and refer to them later. Okay, so I've entered the second equation, 0.5. Oops, I actually put in 2x, two of them. So look, I can go ahead and get rid of one of them. I'm going to just arrow back over, and this is the delete button right here, DEL. And I hit delete, and it got rid of it. So there we go. I didn't have to re-enter the equation, so you don't have to hit clear. You can hit delete. Okay, I want to go ahead and graph this. It should still be on a standard 10 by 10 window. And it's kind of a W shape, and that's good. All right, so it looks like it's crossing at maybe 2 and -2. And this one, it's kind of hard to tell. So I would like to get a little closer. There's a couple ways to do that. I could zoom in. If we use the zoom button, there's a zoom in feature right here, number 2. And it asks you where you want to center it when you zoom in. If we just keep it centered at the origin and zoom in, you notice that it actually is going to cut off the bottom. So even though now I can kind of clearly see that it is crossing at 2 and -2, I can't see where it's crossing the y-axis. So I'm going to manually adjust the window. That's right here, window. And it set it up at -2.5 on both the x and the y-axis. I'm going to go ahead and lower the y minimum because that's the thing I can't see is where it's crossing the y-axis below. And I'm going to go ahead and put that at like -6. Okay. By the way, notice the negative button is next to the enter button. So use that, not the minus. Negative is right there. Okay, let's graph this. All right, it looked to me like it crosses right at -4. And these definitely look like they crossed at 2 and -2. So 2, 0, -2, 0, 0, -4. Those all look like important points to me. Okay, so it looks like this low point right here happens at 1 and -1, but it might be a little bit off. So there's a way to check to see where those low points are occurring, which are called minimums. And that's using the calculate feature, which is above trace. Do you see that? If you hit second calculate, there's a few things that this can do. It can calculate values, zeros. When it calculates zeros, that's calculating the x-intercepts, minimums and maximums. In this case, those 2 low points would be minimums. So I'm going to go ahead and select minimum. And now what it's going to ask me is for going to the left of the minimum and going to the right of the minimum because it wants to know which minimum I'm referring to. So currently I'm on the left of this minimum, so I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. And then it asks now for the right bound, so I'm going to go to the right of the minimum. And it takes a little bit because we're zoomed in so much. There's to the right. And then they want me to guess. In other words, it's just another fail-safe to make sure that we're getting close to where we're interested in. Okay, and this minimum is occurring at 1, -4.5. Now, I mean, it's not exactly 1, so it is a little bit off. But if we round it to 1, it's going to be pretty accurate. So 1, -4.5. And since it appears to be symmetry, I could probably guess that this is going to be -1, -4.5. But I encourage you to go ahead and use the calculate button to verify that it's going to be close to -1 and then -4.5. All right, so let's graph the next one, the third equation here. So go back to y equals. And I'm going to deselect the second equation. And come back here. Okay, so let's enter this one in. Now, as I'm entering, I notice that these are really big values. And the likelihood that it's going to show up on a standard 10 by 10 screen is pretty low. So I'm going to probably want to change the screen. But for the moment, I'm going to go ahead and just do a standard 10 by 10 screen. I'm just going to go ahead and select number 6. Zoom. Okay, I see where it crosses the x-axis, but I have no idea what else is going on. And so far, it's so zoomed in, I just really don't know anything. Okay, so let's adjust the window. That'll be the best way. Rather than trying to zoom out, let's just try to make a good adjustment. Now, because these are in the hundreds, and this is near 700. I'm going to want to make these pretty big. Now, I saw where it crossed the x's, so I'm not going to fuss with the x's, but I'm going to change the y's. So I think I'm going to change them to 1,000. You can keep fiddling with it, but I think 1,000 is going to be safe with 700. Now, see this thing that says Y scale? That's how many tick marks they're going to put in. In other words, they're going to put a tick mark every one value of Y, which means I'll have 1,000 tick marks on each axis of the Y axis, which is just way too many. So I'm actually going to change that to 100 so that each tick mark is at 100, and then select graph. So it looks like a 10 by 10 window, but the Y values are actually at 100, and now I can see it better. The X values, though, are at 1 because I didn't change those, and that's this equation. So it's actually similar to an x cubed graph, except it's going the opposite direction. All right, so let's get our information for graphing. It looks like it's crossing at 2 and -2. I'm not definite. We could find out definitely, though. We could use the table feature. So let's go to the table feature there. Oh, actually, I'm going to go ahead and have the table generate, see how it's still on those values. But here, we'll just do -2 and see what we get. 1.84, or I'm sorry, 184. So it's not crossing at -2. All right, but I could just go to the table set and change this up to auto, just so it automatically produces the values. Okay, but it is crossing at 0, 0. So let's write that one down. Okay, but the other values are so big, I'm going to wait. I'm going to make sure. So it looks like it's crossing at -1 and -500.5, and then 1 and 500.5. Okay, I'm actually going to go and write those down, just in case. I can always not use it later. Okay. All right, go back to the graph for a moment. I'd like to know where it's crossing the x-axis. That would be really nice. So I'm going to go back to the calculate feature. And that 0 option, you'll remember that calculates the x-intercepts. We're going to use it this time. Now it's asking for a left bound again. In other words, it wants me to get close to which 0 I want this calculator to find. So currently I'm centered at the origin. I'm going to go ahead and move a little bit along the graph using the right arrow key. And when it means left, what it really means is left on the graph relative to the 0. So I'm left right there on the graph relative to the 0. And then to go right, I'm just going to keep arrowing right so it actually drops below. And then for my guess, I'll just get close. And there it is. So it has a 0 at 1.9 and 0. Now it looks like it's symmetrical, and then it's going to have -1.9 and 0 is the other one. So I'll write that down. And the only other key points I'd like to know is these 2 points here, this little maximum and this little minimum. So we know how to do that. That's using the calculate feature. Go to, this time we'll do maximum, left bound, so I'm going to get to the left of the maximum, okay, to the right of the maximum, and a guess, close enough. So the maximum is occurring at 1.08 and 504.8, which probably means the minimum is symmetrical but negative, since it's in the third quadrant. So I'll write the negative version. All right, so there's all that basic information we need for graphing, which I'll do in just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and go through this bonus feature, which is going through fractions on the calculator. A lot of students don't know how to do fractions on the calculator. So to get out of the graphing, you could just hit clear until you escape, and then you're back to the home screen, or you could hit second quit, and that'll also exit you out of anything you're in. Okay, so let's do some graphing, some fractions. Let's say I want to add, let's say 1/4 plus 2/3. Okay, I want to add those two fractions. So the way you enter it is you use division, so 1 divided by 4 plus 2 divided by 3. But to get your answer into fractions, you're going to select math, which is below the alpha button. Very first option, fraction. Hit enter, brings you back to the home screen, and now it's going to place your answer into a fraction. So if you hit enter, there's our answer, 11/12. Okay, let's say I actually meant minus, all right? Rather than re-enter the problem, there's a way to pull down the previous entry. If you hit second, enter, see how it says entry? It's going to pull the previous entry down, and I can just change that plus sign to minus. So -5/12 would be the minus version of this, okay? You can also use your previous answer to do the next part of the problem. So like, let's say I wanted to do 1/5 divided by -5/12. Let's say I wanted to do that problem right there. So I'd enter 1/5. By the way, you're going to want to put these in parentheses because the calculator needs to know order of operations. So put 1/5 in parentheses. And then rather than put that by hand, if I hit second and then answer, which is above the negative button, it actually pulls the previous answer down. Oops, I didn't put my thing in fractions. Oh, all right. So let's just re-enter it. I thought I was being so clever. I can't pull the previous problem down because it's going to pull this answer when it refers to answer. So I'm just going to actually re-enter it all. Silly, silly, silly. And there we go. So -12/25. It also can reduce fractions. Like let's say I wanted to reduce the fraction 112/572, something horrible like that. If you put that in, 112/572, and then go to the fraction button, it'll reduce it. So it's 28 1/43. So that's nice. It's a nice little feature. Okay, so now I'm just going to go back and graph these really quick, sketch them real fast so that we have our basic graphs here. Because this is a blank axis, I'm going to set this up as 10 by 10. Actually, I'm not going to worry about the x-axis as much. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Only because that one doesn't need the 10 marks. It's really the y-axis that does. So that one, I'll do 10. And that one, I'll do 10. Okay, so 0, -8 would be right here. 1, -7 would be right here. 2, 0, and then -1, -9. And it was kind of that S shape. So it looks something like that. Okay. All right, for the next graph, I don't need it to be so spread out, so I think I'll just go by like 5. Okay, so 2, 0, -2, 0, 0, -4, and then 1, -4.5, and -1, -4.5. So this was the one that looked like a W. It's kind of a sad looking W, but it's pretty close. All right, last graph here. So this one, since I'm having hundreds, I'm going to go ahead and do that as hundreds on the y-axis, but I'll go only ones on the x-axis. So I'm going to label that that's a 3, and that's at -3. And that's 700. 700 there. Okay. 0, 0. 1, 500.5, which was pretty close to 500, so we'll just put it there. And, oh, sorry, 1, 500.5 would be right here. Oops, ignore that. And then -1, 500.5 would be right here. And then 1.9, close to 2. And then -1.9, close to -2, okay? And then it's kind of this basic graph right there. And there you go.